Okay, good morning. I think we can start. I think the others will just come in. And anyway, this lecture is being recorded so they can actually just catch up with the lecture as we go along. So thank you very much for attending today's lecture. And I hope everybody is well and safe today and in otherwise good spirits. Uh, so please, I thank you for coming in uh, for today's lecture. So I'll begin the lecture by uh, sharing my screen. Okay, so we'll proceed with the lecture today. So our lecture is about now demand and supply. So this is really our the market basics. So in this lecture, we will answer the following questions. One, what are the factors that affect the buyer's demand for goods? And analogously, what are the factors that affect the seller's supply of goods? So we look at the different factors or influences that affect the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied of goods. In this lecture, we will also look at the interaction of demand and supply, and this interaction determines the price of a good and the quantity sold. So we'll see how these two determine the price of a good and the quantity sold. Then we will look at what we call comparative statics, meaning how the changes in the factors that affect demand or supply affect the market outcomes. And by market outcomes, we look at the market price and the quantity bought and sold of a good. And through these, we will have an idea how the markets allocate resources. So in effect, we're going to answer the question of how the markets organize economic activity. And one of the basic question of which is how does it allocate resources? Okay. Before we start, we again review our definitions of a market and we lay down some assumptions about what kind of market we are going to be talking about. Okay. If you recall, our definition of a market is a group of buyers and sellers in touch with one another to buy and sell a particular product. No? And if you recall last time's lecture, we noted that it's very important to define that particular product. Then we focus on what we call a competitive market. A competitive market is one where there are many buyers and sellers. Each has a negligible effect on price. No? In today's times, it's very easy, not very easy, but you can think about the many online buyers and sellers, and you can think about competitive market in that case, because each one of them is small, each one of them selling, let's say, what's the most popular product now in the market, uh, in the online market, let's say a particular kind of tocino that's being sold online, and you would have many buyers and as well as many sellers of tocino, and each one of them would have a negligible effect on price. No? Uh, and but in the real world, and also we want to assume what we call a perfectly competitive market, meaning all the goods are exactly the same, no? Uh, we have what we call identical products, no? So in effect, what we're saying is that competition is based on price, no? Competition is not based on the characteristics of the products because these products are exactly the same. And therefore, buyers and sellers are so numerous that no one can affect the market price. Each one is a price taker. So if one if you're selling the same kind of tocino and you're pricing at 200 pesos per kilo, while the other is pricing it at 150, then nobody will buy from you because they will all buy from the one who's selling it at 150. So each one, so you should be able to sell at 150 per kilo in order for you to compete. Okay. So in this lecture, we assume that markets are perfectly competitive. Okay. But one caution that we would have to look at is that there are relatively few perfectly competitive markets. No, one cannot really find identical products for one. No, some product would differ in some kind of characteristics. No, uh, but there are many markets in which the number of firms is small enough that some of them, sorry, there are some markets that we'd have very few firms and therefore they would have the ability to affect the market. But for now, we'll assume that we will look at supply and demand in perfectly competitive markets. Okay. Uh, Not because it's realistic, but because it's simpler, no? Uh, and it serves as a benchmark, no, for us to learn about more realistic but complicated, imperfectly competitive markets. Okay, and it gives us a sort of a reference, no, for us to study other outcomes. And in most markets, you can reasonably say that there is some kind of competition, especially uh, if you have, like, for instance, in this time of the pandemic where the digital, where you have online buyers and sellers, uh, there's many of them, and each one is small, and therefore they would kind of approximate a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so in this lecture, we look at the components of the market, the building blocks, and that is demand and supply. All right, so demand, we look at one of the components, which is demand. And demand comes from the behavior of buyers. As we will derive in later lessons, demand results from the actions of individuals as they try to pursue their own goals given their particular constraints. If you recall last time, we assumed that individuals are rational, and they try to do the best for themselves. Okay, so for now, we'll assume that these consumers have gone through that optimization process, and therefore they have determined for themselves, what how much of a good they would be willing to buy. So the quantity demanded of any good is the amount of the good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Okay, so there are two uh, things here: willing and able. So there's the willingness to buy and the ability to buy. So there's capacity to buy. So we will see that later, no? And you have the law of demand, which says that the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of the good rises, other things being equal. Okay, so uh, we assume that, that the quantity demand, that the demand follows the law of demand, meaning that the quantity demanded of the good falls when the price of the good rises, other things being equal. No, we will assume this for now, but when we look at consumer theory, we will see why how this law, no, we will describe how this law is derived. Okay, so demand can be represented in different ways. So we saw that the quantity demanded, can be represented in different ways. We can represent demand via a schedule, a price, via a demand schedule. Okay, so the demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the quantity demanded and the price of the good. Okay, so let's look at this example. Suppose that we are uh, looking at a particular good, which is shomai. Okay, so this is an example of the demand for shomai of a certain person. Let's say Nadine. Okay, so notice that as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. So, for instance, oops, sorry. So, therefore, we see that Nadine's preferences obey the law of demand. So, that means, for instance, when the price is zero, Nadine would want to consume or buy 16 pieces of siomai. But when the price of siomai is 6 pesos per piece, then Nadine would just want to buy 4 pieces of siomai. So we see that this is the demand schedule. It's a table that shows the price of the good and how much of that, how much a person would want to demand of that good at a certain price. Okay. Now, the other way to represent demand is via a demand curve. Okay, so this curve just plots the demand schedule as a graph. Okay, on a graph, we have the price on the vertical and the quantity demanded on the horizontal. And therefore, we can just plot the points corresponding to each price. So we plot the quantity demanded corresponding to each price. So for instance, this point would correspond to this entry in the demand schedule. So you have a price of 0 and you have 16 pieces of siomai demanded. So this entry here would be represented by this next dot, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this line, which connects the dots, would be our representation of demand. And this is what we call the demand curve. Okay. Now, what we have shown here is the demand of an individual person. Okay. So the quantity, but then we differentiate that from the market demand curve. No? The latter is the sum of all the quantities demanded by all the buyers at each price. So on a graph, it is the horizontal sum of all the individual demand curves. So suppose that you have two individuals in this market. Of course, again, for simplicity, we just have two buyers. But note that when we assumed earlier that there's perfect competition, we assume that there are many buyers. Okay, again, so but for simplicity, we'll assume that there are only two buyers in the market. And we can see that we'll reproduce here Nadine's quantity demanded, no? But now we add another buyer. Let's say that is James. And therefore, you have the quantity demanded of James at different prices of siomai. And then if we just assume that these are the two buyers in the siomai market, then their quantity demanded is just the sum of these two persons' quantity demanded at each price. So the market demand is just the horizontal sum of all the individual demand curves at each price. Okay, and therefore we can also plot this as a market demand curve. So again, we use the same procedure as before, where for each price, we plot, what is the total quantity demanded of all the buyers in the market. And so we now hear this blue market demand curve. No? Now, what we have not shown here would be the individual demand curves of James and Nadine. But if you plot them here, you would have, let's say, demand curve of Nadine here, a demand curve of, and then if you add to that the demand curve of James, then you will have this particular market demand curve. Okay. Now, I would like to point out a certain way that economists graph, which is quite different from how mathematicians would do it. Okay. Usually, you would put the independent variable on the horizontal and the dependent variable vertical. However, in this case, we have the price on the vertical. Okay. But we will leave that for now because economists can interpret this quite differently. So later on, we'd say for this quantity to be demanded, how much would the price have to be? Okay. So we have this concept of an inverse demand curve. But for now, we assume that for this price, this is the quantity demanded. Okay, so we'll just note that for the moment. Okay, now uh, we know that the price is not the only factor that affects demand. Okay, when we plot the quantity demanded vis-a-vis the price, we are assuming that all these other factors are at a particular level. Okay, and this is what we mean by all other things being equal. So we're saying that all the other factors, when you plot a particular demand curve, we say that all the other factors at some particular level, no, all, so they're equal, other things being equal. Therefore, any change in these factors will affect how we draw the demand curve. And changes in these factors will shift the demand curve. Okay. And what are these other prices? What are these other influences? We will discuss these in turn. Okay. And we will note that these are the non-price determinants of demand. Okay. So, first factor, of course, is the number of buyers. No, the first thing, that would influence that would shift the demand curve is the number of buyers. Okay, a decrease in an increase in the number of buyers increases the quantity demanded at each price, and it shifts the demand curve to the right. Okay, uh, analogously, a decrease in the number of buyers would have the opposite effect. It would shift the demand curve to the left. So suppose that this is our original demand curve. No, suppose that we have an additional buyer. No, so aside from Nadine and James, there's another one that comes into the market. So now instead of just two, you have three buyers. No? So suppose the buyers increases, then at each price, the quantity demanded will increase. No? So for instance, that particular buyer brings would at, let's say, 1 peso demand 5 units of siopaw, and therefore you would have a shift in the demand curve. No? Because now your demand curve would shift to the right. It would increase. Okay. So now you have this new demand curve that is due to the increase in the number of buyers. Okay. Now, in this example, we have assumed a parallel shift, but that's not necessarily so. No. For instance, a more realistic scenario would involve a non-parallel shift, where the horizontal distance of the shift would be greater for lower prices than higher ones. But for now, we will assume that this is a parallel shift. No, but the more important thing here is that the number of buyers, an increase in the number of buyers, would increase the quantity demanded at each price, and that would result in an increase, a shift outward of your demand curve. No? What would be the other demand shifters? The other factor, of course, is the income of consumers. However, the direction of the effect of changes in income depends on the type of the good that we are considering. Okay, when we distinguish two types of goods, a normal good and an inferior good. A normal good is a good whose demand increases as income increases. An inferior good is one whose quantity demanded decreases as income increases. So if a good is a normal good, then an increase in income will increase the quantity demanded at each price, shifting the demand curve to the right. However, the opposite will prevail if the good is an inferior good. So what's an example of a normal good? What I can use an example would be smartphones. Okay, as income increases, we expect the demand for smartphones to increase. No, so if your income increases, you would want to buy probably a smartphone with more features, no, greater uh, memory, more cameras, But what is an example of an inferior good? So an example would be the opposite, a basic talk and text phone. Yung mga old Nokia na walang smart screen, ay walang touch screen, just usual basic talk and text. No, so as income increases, we expect that demand for these types of phone would also decrease. So this is what we call an inferior good. Okay. Now, uh, note that normal goods and inferior goods are not really absolute. You cannot say that one good is always a normal good and one good is an inferior good. It depends, no? So for a wealthy person, for instance, a compact car like a Vios would be an inferior good, no? As a wealthy person's wealth increases or income increases even more, no? They would shift their demand from a luxury, from a compact car to a luxury imported SUV. So that would be a normal good for them. And the compact car would be like an inferior good. So really have to look at the so this is just what I wanted to note here, no? Hindi naman talaga siya uh, absolute. It really depends also on the particular income of that particular consumer. What for that consumer is a normal good and what is an inferior good. Okay. Usually, normal goods are also goods that have higher quality. Like the usual example would be like when your income increases, you shift consumption from butter to from margarine to butter. So butter is being the more better quality good. So that's kind of a normal good. Okay. So therefore, when when income increases, you would expect that the demand for a normal good would increase, okay? And therefore, that would result in a shift outward of the demand curve for that normal good, no? So you would increase the quantity demanded at each price. But for an inferior good, as income increases, you would expect that the quantity demanded of that good would uh, decrease, and therefore your demand curve for inferior goods would shift to the left. Okay. All right. Now, the other influence on price, of course, is the prices of related goods. No, and in here, we also know that good may have what we call substitutes. No, uh, more formally, two goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the demand for the other. Okay, so for instance, if we are looking at our example, which is shawmai, so that's a kind of street food. So a substitute good for that, a related good is isaw, no? So if we're thinking of a quick snack for students, then the substitute good for shawmai can be isaw. So when isaw becomes more expensive, then students will consume less of isaw and instead consume more of shawmai at the same price of shawmai. So in effect, you're saying because these two are uh, what you call related, no? They are snacks, street food that students consume. So if the price of the substitute, let's say isaw, becomes higher, no, then we would expect that the quantity demanded for shawmai would increase. Okay. Uh, so there are other examples. For instance, here, of course, uh, the Coke and Pepsi, they're related because they're cola, right? Types of cola. So if the price of Coke increases, then you would expect demand for Pepsi to increase, no? Assuming that people cannot distinguish the taste, right? No, they would, for them that they're the same. Of course, that's not uh, very realistic, no? But they're related goods, no? Uh, So other examples would be pizza and hamburgers. An increase in the price of pizza increases the demand for hamburgers, shifting the hamburger demand curve to the right. You also have, for instance, laptops and desktops. No? So if the price of laptops decrease, no, then you would expect the demand for desktop computers to decrease, right? Because laptops became less expensive, a desktop is a substitute good for laptops, and therefore people will shift consumption or will shift, no, to buying laptops instead of desktop, and therefore the quantity demanded of desktops would decrease. Okay. Now, there's another type of relationship between goods, and that is that of being complements. No, so these are usually goods that are consumed together. So, like for instance, if you want to consume coffee, right? That you're always consuming coffee with donuts. So we think of these two goods are complements. No, you consume them in some proportion to each other. No, and therefore we can say that two goods are complements if an increase in the price of one causes a fall in the demand for the other. So, for instance, if the price of coffee increases, you would consume less coffee, and therefore you would also consume less donuts because you consume the two together, no, at some ratio. Okay. Other examples would be computers and software. So if the price of computer rises, people buy fewer computers, and therefore they would require less software. And so uh, when the price of the computer rises, the demand for computer software shifts to the left. No? The quantity demanded decreases. Okay. Other examples, of course, when tuition increases, no, uh, then you would consume less textbooks. Why? Because of course you would not enroll. No, you would probably enroll in less units, and therefore you would require less textbooks. Uh, if you're, mommy and shomai eater, right? If the price of shomai increases, then you would also reduce your demand for instant noodles because you consume the two together. Okay, so these are uh, complements. Okay, so in effect, when what we can say that, you know, the impact of the prices of related goods depend on how the two goods are related to each other. So if they are substitutes, then an increase of the price of one good would cause an increase in the demand for the other. But if the two goods are complements, an increase in the price of one causes a fall in the demand for the other. Okay. The other, of course, is and preferences, no? Anything that causes a shift in taste towards a good will increase demand for that good and shift its demand curve to the right. Okay, so what are some, of course, people have different preferences, and if there's suddenly a good that becomes popular or people suddenly develop a taste for it, then we would expect that the demand curve will shift to the right. Example, yung sushi bake, no, that became popular recently, causing an increase in demand for it, no. Of course, also endorsements of celebrities have increased demand for the products that they endorse because somehow they have shifted the taste of people. Okay? So, halimbawa, yung mga Korean stars that are now endorsing your mobile phone services, no? You would expect that, if people suddenly want to be like their Korean idols, then they would increase the demand for the mobile phone services that these two stars are endorsing. Okay? Right. The other thing that that we have observed in the Philippines is that a lot of our commercials are about shampoo, and so there are different endorsements of shampoo. Somehow they make you feel like your hair will grow longer if you patronize a certain kind of shampoo. Okay, so this is really done to influence your taste, and once your taste differed, then your demand curve will either shift to the right or the left, no, depending if people are saying don't consume that, then it will shift to the left, right? Okay. The other factor that affects demand, of course, is our expectations. Okay. So aside from income, this is probably the more salient factor that we face today. No, when people do not expect that things will improve in the near future, then they curb their consumption now. No, for instance, if we expect that the virus will not be controlled soon, then people may curtail their spending on goods that may be considered as luxuries even now. No? Even if they have the income, let's say they didn't really have, sorry, they're still gainfully employed, they're still getting their salaries, no? But if they expect no, that the virus will not be controlled soon, then people may curtail their spending on goods that are considered as luxury. So they will not buy too much. No, people are postponing consumption if they expect the times will be hard. However, of course, if they're expecting some gains, then people may instead increase their consumption now in anticipation of such gains. Okay, so if people expect their incomes to rise, no, for instance, then they will already base their consumption on that expected increase in income. So their demand for meals at expensive restaurants may increase now. If economy SARS and people worry about their future job security, then their demand for new cars may fall now. Okay? If you're expecting something like a tax, no, to increase on cars, for instance, they would now borrow next year, then they would purchase cars now. This happened in uh, with the train law, no. The excise tax on cars was supposed to increase, let's say 2018, 2019, 2018, 19. And so the car sales increased in 2017 because people, expect that taxes will increase, so they are actually buying ahead. No? So these are some of the factors that affect demand. No, so these are the variables that influence buy, uh, buyers. No, so of course the price of the good, its own price, and it causes a movement along the demand curve. It affects the quantity demanded. I'll explain the difference between a movement and the shift. An increase in the number of, or any change in the number of buyers shifts the demand curve. Income shifts the demand curve. Any change in the prices of related goods shifts the demand curve. Any revisions in taste uh, would also shift the demand curve, and expectations also shift the demand curve. Okay, so note that the only determinant of quantity demanded that causes a movement along that curve is price. No, note that all of these things influence the quantity demanded of the good. But when you look at the demand curve, no, as we've drawn it, a change in the price would just move you along the demand curve, will be represented as a movement along the demand curve. But all the other things that we've uh, kept constant, or all the other things that we, all the other things being equal, no, these things, no, if any of these change, then that would be represented as a shift in the demand curve. Okay, so what's the rule of thumb to help you remember whether the curve shifts? If the variable causing demand to change is measured on one of the axes, you move along the curve. So if you recall, when we plotted the demand curve, the price was in one of the axes. So whenever there's a change in price, that would just be represented as a move along the demand curve. Okay. If the variable that's causing demand to change is not measured on either axis, then the curve shifts. Okay, so that's a handy thing to remember, no? And it will also apply, for instance, when we look at supply. Okay, and we will just go to that next. So what is, let's look at supply, the other side of the market. Okay, so supply comes from the behavior of sellers, like demand. Supply comes from the results of decisions of sellers based on their motives or objectives and the technological and cost constraints that they face. And this is represented by the quantity supplied, no? So or by supply, sorry. So the quantity supplied of any good is the amount that sellers are willing and able to sell. So you now have this, again, willingness. So they're okay to trade, they're okay to sell, and they're able to do so, meaning they have the means to produce that particular quantity. Okay, and the law, uh, and we assume that uh, the law of supply prevails, meaning the claim that the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises, other things being equal. Okay, so again, similar to the case of demand, supply can be represented by a supply schedule. Again, this is a table that shows the relationship between the price of the good and the quantity supplied. And suppose, let's say that we have one supplier, let's say the UPSE Co-op. Let's just imagine that it's now online. So it's now an online supplier of siomai. You can order online. And at these prices, these are the amounts that they're willing to supply of siomai. No? And we note that as the price increases, the quantity that they are willing to supply also increases, and therefore they obey the supply schedule, obeys the law of supply. Okay. Similar to the demand curve, no, we can represent supply also through a supply curve, and that's just plotting the quantity supply at various prices as a graph. So again, we can see this entry here where the price is 0 and the supply is also 0. As we increase the price, the quantity supplied also increases. And you can see these plots. And that results in an individual seller supply curve. Okay. Again, so that's our supply curve. Again, we distinguish an individual firm supply from the market supply. The market supply is the sum of the quantity supplied by all sellers at each price. Suppose now that we have two sellers here again, while we note that the perfectly competitive market would have would have many sellers, we're just assuming for simplicity that we have two. And suppose that this is again the supply of the UPSE Co-op, and Atiging, our food supply at our UPSE canteen, is now willing to supply siomai at different prices. No? So for instance, for the same price, at 1 peso per siomai, Atiging would be willing to supply 2 units, while the UPSE Co-op will be willing to supply 3. Okay. And therefore, the market supply is just the sum of these two sellers' individual supplies. Okay. Again, we can plot the market supply curve. And this is just the horizontal sum of the two individual seller supply curves. So this is the market supply. Again, for each price, we just plot the quantity supplied by the two sellers in the market. Okay. And again, similar to demand, aside from the price of the good, other factors affect supply. These are held constant when we draw a particular supply curve. Thus, changes in these factors will shift the supply curves. So these non-price determinants of supply simply means the things other than the price of the good that determines the seller's supply of the good. And changes in them shift the supply curve. Okay. What are some of these factors? Input prices. No? Inputs are the resources that firms use to produce the good. Should the prices of these inputs change, the profits of the firms are affected, and therefore their willingness to supply the good at a particular price is also affected. So when an input becomes cheaper, then production is more profitable at each output price, so firms supply a larger quantity at each price. On the other hand, as inputs become more expensive, then firms supply a lesser quantity. Okay? So the net effect of this is that a fall in input prices would increase the supply. Suppose the price of pork falls. At each price, the quantity of siomai supplied will increase. Okay? Because now pork, which is the main ingredient for your siomai, is now cheaper, then firms would be willing to supply more at each output price. Okay? Uh, and therefore, we can now draw, we can see that now the orange is the shifted supply curve. All right. What about another factor? Technology. Technology determines how much inputs are required to produce a unit of output. So that a cost-saving technological improvement has the same effect as a fall in input prices. It shifts the supply curve to the right. Okay, so suppose that before each siomai has to be formed by hand. Now there's a machine that was invented that could form the siomai automatically. So that means that it would require less labor to form one siomai. And therefore, this would save wages and therefore shift the supply curve to the right. You need less labor to produce siomai, and therefore you need less wages. And therefore, it would shift it would make the firm more profitable. And therefore, it would shift the supply curve to the right. Also, of course, an increase in the number of sellers increases the quantity supplied at each price, and therefore it will shift the supply curve to the right. Okay? And the last, at least for now, would be expectations. Okay? Uh, for instance, uh, expectations influence the willingness of firms to supply. In this pandemic, for example, firms may expect that people's income will not recover swiftly, so that they expect prices to remain low. This may explain the decision of firms to cut back supply even more in the present. So even now they're adjusting supply. No? So in some cases, firms may even exit the market and therefore supply is reduced. No? So this sellers may adjust supply when their expectations of future prices change. No? And what happens if they feel that prices will be less in the future, then they would shift supply to the left. They would decrease supply. No? Uh, an example that I gave before was on train. No? They expected that the tax on cigarettes will increase, and therefore what happened? They because of the tax, prices would they would expect that consumers would consume less, right? And so what they did was they chose to increase production because they expected that consumers will not consume a lot because of the price, because of the taxes on uh, uh, cigarettes for next year. So what they did was they shifted the supply curve in this year. Okay. Therefore, to summarize, no, uh, the variables that influence the quantity supplied, of course, price. Okay, and similar to the effect on the quantity demanded, a change in price causes a movement along the supply curve, while all the other things that we have kept constant. No, when we drew a particular supply curve, any change in those would shift the supply curve. Okay, so input prices, technology, the number of sellers, and expectations would shift the supply curve either to the right or left, depending on the direction of the change in all of these factors. So I will end there, and in the next lecture, we will bring the two together, supply and demand, we'll see how their interaction results in particular market outcomes. So I think we have time for, okay, good morning. Uh, arbitrary po ba yung pag-assign ng price sa y-axis and quantity sa x-axis? O ito po yung standard? I'll answer that. For now, yes, we know economists usually put the price in the y-axis and the quantity in the x-axis. But there's a particular reason for that, no? In some cases, we refer to what we call an inverse demand. And so the interpretation is that the x-axis is the independent variable and the y-axis is the dependent variable. But for now, we will look at what we call the normal demand curve, where the y-axis is the independent variable, in this case, no price, and the dependent variable is quantity, which is on the x-axis. So that let's use that convention for now, the standard. Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. So you talked about bios being an inferior good, but can also be considered as a normal good since people only buy cars when they have enough income already. Definitely. With this, how can we bridge the gap of the subjectivity of this criteria? Well, as I mentioned earlier, no, there's really no absolute about a good being inferior or normal. No, it also depends on where, on the particular income and preferences of your consumer. So, for instance, in this case, no, if you are, let's say, a middle class individual, right, somebody who's in the middle classes, no, then the normal good for them would be the bios, no, because they're now going like buying a car, right? And the inferior good for them might be a motorcycle, right? So as incomes increase, you can see that the demand for cars, subcompact cars can increase, and the demand for, let's say, motorcycles can be a what do you call it? An inferior good. Okay, so you have to also look at the particular consumers, no, when you're talking about normal good and inferior good. Of course, there's some usual goods that can be considered as normal goods. No, usually goods that are of better quality would usually be considered as normal goods, whereas goods that are not of better quality would be considered as inferior goods. No? But depending on that example of the rich person who is actually shifting from a car to an SUV, no, for him the car is inferior, but for some and for him the SUV is a normal good. Okay. For substitute products, do the substitute products have to be equal, like in price, quality, and taste? Not necessarily. No. So, for instance, when you talk about snacks, no, there are many different kinds of snacks. So you have shoma, you have isaw, you have noodles. So, but they can equally satisfy your hunger, no? Or there are ways to satisfy your hunger, and therefore they are related. They can be substitutes for one another, no? So that's why there are related goods. They're not exactly identical goods. Okay. Can a good be classified normal, inferior at certain situation, and substitute in another situation? I'm not sure about how to interpret this question. Can a good be classified normal, inferior at a certain situation? Okay. Okay. Let's consider the ano food, for instance. Okay, food. Um, if you're talking about, let's say, dati ang example namin noon was fish and meat because fish was supposed to be inferior and meat was supposed to be a normal good, meaning as you, because dati the idea was that fish was consumed by those with lower incomes, and then as your incomes increase, you would increase your consumption of meat. So meat is then considered a normal good. Pero ngayon, iba na yata. Mas mahal na yung fish kaya fish is now becoming the normal good. But in any case, okay. So in the whole scheme of things of food, let's say uh, meat is a normal good. As incomes increase, the quantity of meat that you would consume also increases. But when you talk about substitutes. Okay. For instance, if you're talking about beef and pork, okay? Now, these two uh, can be used to say, let's say, cook adobo, all right? Or maybe it should be chicken and pork. Okay. These two can be used to cook adobo. No? So if the price of pork increases, right, then you would tend to use more chicken when you cook adobo. So in this case, they're substitutes in consumption. Okay. So when you're talking about normal and inferior, talking about how they respond, how the quantity demanded changes as a response to changes in income. But when you talk about substitutes and complements, you're talking about how the quantity demanded responds to changes in the prices of a related good. So yun yung difference. So of course, definitely they can be both normal, inferior, and substitute. It just depends on what kind of analysis you're talking about, whether you're talking about how they respond to changes in income of the consumer. And the concept of substitutes and complementation is how they respond, how the quantity demanded responds to changes in the price of a related good. So I guess that would be the, the difference between the two. Okay? All right. So thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your questions. These are really good questions, and I hope I was able to clarify. So we'll end the lecture here and continue on Thursday. Just continuing with supply and demand together. So we'll look at now the interaction since we've already kind of discussed, the two parts of the market, which is demand and supply. Okay, so thank you very much, and that ends our lecture for today. If I was not able to answer some questions, I think your discussion leaders will take note of them. No? All right. Thanks a lot. And see you on Thursday.